So you're at the point where I've kind of given you this advice on things that you should avoid, things that you shouldn't do, and I've said that I've encouraged you all. I've said that you can write a book, that any of you can have it in you to write a book, and you might say, okay, well, what's the initial story idea? How am I going to get the idea of what the book's about? And this seems to either be there's just two radically different people, and there's just some people that story ideas just seem to endlessly come to people. They just get flooded with them. They just without even any effort, they get more story ideas than they can write up all of them. And so the idea of having to search for a story idea just seems weird for them because they're sifting through all of these story ideas that they can't turn off. And then there's some people who do like to write and they're interested in writing, but they find it a lot harder to come up with story ideas. And years and years and years ago, Rose Estes and Jim Ward were both workers at TSR. Jim Ward wrote he wrote Deities and Demigods, was one of the big things from the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons system, but he wrote a lot of different things. He was involved in a lot of different things at TSR when he was there. And Rose Estes was working at TSR, and she wrote a lot of the Dungeons and Dragons brand choose your own adventure books. So there's books that were set in Dungeons and Dragons worlds, and they were written by TSR authors, and this Rose Estes wrote a lot of them. And her books are great. People love them. People still sort of try to get signed copies from her to this day. But she found it really hard to come up with ideas for books, and she'd go to Jim Ward and sort of say, we want to write a book kind of in this genre or around this idea, but I just can't come up with a story idea. And Jim Ward would just rattle off an idea to her, and she'd say, oh, that's a good idea, and she'd go off and write it. So this just seems to be something that people just have lots of ideas that they don't, and it's not true for all writers. There are writers who seem to struggle a little bit coming up with the initial story ideas. For people who have this abundance ideas, it's investing in the right one that's the challenge. So for Jim Ward, with all of these ideas, deciding which one to develop is his challenge. And so filtering through them and getting rid of the ones that aren't that great ideas and picking the right one to develop is the challenge. And I talked earlier about how Stephen King has the advice, don't write down ideas. Wait for the ideas that you just can't stop thinking about. And that's his way of finding the ideas that are just irresistible, and how he finds kind of which of his surplus of ideas he should invest in. For people with few ideas, I talked about ideas for ripping off existing work. And so you could do like a Terry Brooks style where you take a book and kind of tear it down and then write your own version of that book. Or get ideas from people with lots of them, like Rose Estes did with Jim Ward. And all sorts of writers will happily kind of pass along ideas. Typically, the people who come up with ideas really easily have no problem throwing them around, or they're happy to do a quick brainstorming session with you and kind of come up with a few different ideas, one of which would work. So that's something, some ideas how to come up with the initial story idea. Beyond this, I think writing to market is a really, really, really good idea. And so what I mean by this is write books that readers want to read, that readers want to buy. And sometimes in writers' communities, they'll view this as a conflict between crass commercialism, you're just writing something for people to buy, versus higher art, that we're writers, we're trying to illuminate the human condition. And so writing something just because it's going to sell is an insult to our dignity as a writer. And I have no problem writing to market. I'm far more on the crass commercialism side of things, but things can be both. And so you can write what you want to write, but then also write what people want to read. And you just filter ideas down to this. So whenever you come up with an idea that you want to write, but there isn't a market for it, that's maybe a reason to dismiss that idea. And whenever you come up with an idea that there's a market for it, but you don't want to write it, dismiss that idea. You're not going to do a good job on an idea that you don't want to write, and just keep working on ideas. And then the ones that both are things that you want to write and things that there are a market, that's a really good contender for the idea you should move forward with. It's really depressing to write something and to put a lot of work and hours into coming up with the idea and thinking about it and writing the book and revising it and designing a cover and packaging it up and releasing it, and have no one be interested in the book. That's like a really depressing experience. And there was years ago, I was writing for a personal finance blog. So we talk about, investing in real estate and frugality and things like that. And there was a guy in the blogging sphere. Back then, people weren't as competitive in blogs. And so we'd all help one another. And this guy wrote a book, and it was called Demolishing Your Debt. And so it was written for people who were deep, deep, deep in debt, with all of these strategies for how to dig themselves out of debt and kind of pay off their debt and become debt free. And so he spent a lot of time working on this book, and he wrote it up, and then he went to all his friends in the blogosphere, and he got them all to do reviews of it and interviews and promote his book. And he did this huge push after he'd done all the work to try to tell people about this, and really got the word out about this book, Demolish the Debt, and Demolish Your Debt. And a few months later, he's writing a retrospective on this, and he kind of talked about all these things he did. He put a lot of work into it. You got to give the guy credit. He really, really, really worked on this. And he didn't sell a single copy. Nobody bought this book. And so the only people who read it were the other bloggers who were his friends that he sent kind of review copies to discuss it. And there wasn't a single customer who bought his book. And the problem is the kind of people who get themselves deep, deep in debt aren't the kind of people who are going to buy a book to figure out how to get out of it, right? They're going to go to a bankruptcy trustee, or they're going to go to family and friends and beg for money, but they wouldn't be deep in debt if they were the kind of people who'd go and get a book and figure out how to deal with the situation. And so there just literally was no market for the book he wrote. There was nobody who would read the book. The people who would read it didn't have the problem he was solving, and the people with the problem he was solving weren't willing to read his book. So that's like a heartbreaking story for a writer, to hear something like that and just hear that something bombed to that degree. That's really, really rough. Right now, romance and lit RPGs are two really hungry genres. And so if you had any interest in romance novels, or if you had any interest in lit RPGs, those would be great genres to write in, because they're so hungry. There's going to be readers that right away are really interested in it. Sometimes super niche sub genres can be hungry, like the werewolf romances I mentioned earlier. And so if you can find something that's just this very, very, very narrow niche, sometimes they are just deeply interested in new books. And if that happens to be something that you're already reading, then that's wonderful, right? Because you're reading it, so you kind of know what the reader expectations are, you know what the books are like, and that's a really good contender to write a book in that sub genre if you're a reader in that. If you read something that's just a really niche book, that's a really, really great idea. As I just said, writing a subgenre that you've read a lot of, that's to me, the people who seem to be wildly successful debut indie authors, when they write their first book and they just kind of release it, and when they just sell way more copies than they're expecting, it always seems to be the case that there's this subgenre that they are really like reading, and so they decide they're going to contribute to that subgenre themselves and write that style of book. And that seems to be the ones that just really take off like a rocket. And you know what the expectations of the readers are in that subgenre really intimately, because you're one of them. So every time you kind of think, well, what would like readers want from this book, you can answer that, because you're basically writing it for people just like you. And you writing the book that you would want to read that's missing from the market, oftentimes there'll be other readers who feel the exact same way. And then that could just be the book that they've been waiting for and they're kind of dying to read. With the limitations that were discussed earlier, this could be fan fiction. So if there's a setting, or if there's a series of books, or if there's some role playing setting that you're a real fan of, that might be a good thing to write, and you're a fan of it. So there's probably other people who are out and interested in reading about it. Oh, and I mentioned earlier that I couldn't remember the name. It's Fire and Dust by James Allen Gardner, which was the Planescape book that he wrote in its entirety for TSR, and then TSR refused to publish it, and so he just kind of wrote that book, and then couldn't really do anything with it, and so it's really, really kind of sad. So when you're coming up with your initial story idea and when you're sort of developing it, you want to have an understanding and incorporating tropes. And if you're not familiar with the term tropes, these are just kind of conventions in storytelling that are recognized by the audience. And so at a certain point, they just become so overused that they become cliches. So tropes are things kind of on their way to becoming cliches that aren't quite yet. So happily ever after in romances is a trope. People don't like romance novels that end in kind of like a failed relationship. They want the people to get together at the end of the book. They expect their happily ever after. In fantasy, the chosen one is a trope, right? That from the beginning of Harry Potter, Harry Potter's destined to fight Voldemort. He's the chosen one, right? And there's the chosen one in tons and tons of fantasy. So with the genre you're writing in, you need to understand the tropes, just being aware of them as expectations of the reader, that people in romance, they expect the happily ever after. They don't all have to be used and they don't all have to be followed, but you have to be aware of them. And when you reject them, you have to really understand why and how you're rejecting them. And so Brandon Sanderson deconstructs tropes in his books, and that's resonated with readers. So he's very aware of the trope, but then he kind of breaks it down. So in Mistborn, for example, it's a world it's a dystopian, damaged world that's set like 1,000 years after the chosen one went on their quest to save the world. And as the book progresses, you get little bits about what was happening with this chosen one when they were on their quest 1,000 years previously. And at the end of the book, what it turns out is that the chosen one's kind of henchmen there, like Sam Gamgee, turned on them at the climax of their quest and took their place. And so this henchman basically killed the chosen one and then took their place in what the chosen one was destined to be doing. So Brandon Sanderson, he deconstructed it. His narrative wasn't about the chosen one. It was about in this world that was damaged by someone violating the chosen one trope, right? J. Michael Straczynski talks about inverting tropes as sometimes a really good way to get ideas. And so he had the idea when he was doing a Superman run of comics that Superman had been sent to Earth not to save him as a baby from a dying planet, but as a vanguard for an invasion force. So Superman as the advanced troop for an invasion. And Invincible has this idea, right? It inverts the Superman trope. Instead of Superman fighting for truth, justice, and the American way and being the most noble of all of us, he's in Invincible, the Superman character is an invader, right? And he's here using all of his powers to subjugate Earth. And so that can be kind of an interesting thing when you're trying to develop an idea, to have tropes that you invert. And J. Michael Straczynski, is one of his techniques for trying to generate ideas, is he'll think about these things and he'll invert the core of a lot of these fictions and then see if there's an interesting story once it's kind of turned on its head. While you're developing your idea, you're going to start thinking about character ideas and coming up with characters. And here on the side, there's a joke off of Reddit, I believe, and that the first time you make a Dungeons and Dragons character, they're a reflection of you, the player. So they're what you would be like if you were a paladin in a fantasy world. But then once you've played a bunch of games and you're a veteran Dungeons and Dragons player, you create a character that's a piece of bread that uses the mage hand spell to carry itself, right? We get into these like weirder and stranger characters. And this was is part of the idea. This is the thing I'm talking about, that role playing is just really good practice for writing books, because the the characters we develop, we go through a lot of the practice of making up characters, and the fact that they're making such weird characters shows how sort of proficient players have become, to the point that people are joking about the weird characters people start making. Beyond kind of the genre and your story idea, you're going to need characters to go through the story, go through the adventure that you're thinking about. And you're going to need protagonists. And this is the role that player characters would typically play in a role playing game. And just because of the nature of the game, oftentimes many role playing groups will have 6 characters. So this would be like a novel that would have 6 protagonists, which is a lot. A lot of stories, when you're reading books, will have a lot fewer protagonists than a typical role playing session. And a lot of them will just have one protagonist. You're going to need antagonists and minor characters, and so these are the NPCs for that you've had in role-playing games. And so all of the practice that you've had as like a dungeon master running games, you've been creating interesting NPCs, and you can make them for your novel the exact same way. And you need to and should. So there's going to be antagonists who they fight, and there's going to be minor characters that they meet on the way on their adventure. Past role playing games can sometimes be a good source of characters. So, if there was a player that just created a super memorable character in a session years ago, or I gave the example earlier that I had an NPC that was a Valkyrie, an incompetent Valkyrie, this you can mine them for characters. And I think that's can be a great source of characters in your story. And if somebody else created the character, if it was a player who created them, then you should get their permission before you use that character in your story, just to be reasonable. People you know can be a great idea for character ideas. So family members and coworkers and friends, and people you've had conflicts with might make good enemies. But you can think about, how would my Uncle Jack respond to this situation? And that can be a good way to build a character that's around that person, since you know them so well. Self inserts are how people normally start role playing, right? So I'm going to make a paladin that's just like me. They think that the same way I do. They have the similar values to me, and that's who I'm going to play. And so this is something that you can do with a book as well. And you can go overboard with this. So if you insert yourself into the fiction and then everything good happens to the character, they never have any adversity and they never have any setbacks, that's what people call a Mary Sue character, right? So it's, you've put yourself into the work and it's just wish fulfillment. And that's not very interesting for readers. So you don't really want to do that, but you could put yourself into the work, as long as it's not a Mary Sue type situation where everything's going that character's way. Um, the Mary Sue actually came from the Star Trek fan fiction. And so back in the 60s, one of the early Star Trek fan fictions, there was Lieutenant Mary Sue who showed up on the Enterprise. And she was smarter than Spock and more strategic than Kirk, and a better engineer than Scotty. And she just went around the Enterprise doing everything better. And she was just this superhero that was just better than every other character on board at everything. And then she, of course, sacrificed herself to save the ship at the end of the story. And everybody on the Enterprise loved her and was sad that she died, right? And it was just a bad story. It was wish fulfillment for the woman who wrote it, and it's typically regarded as something to avoid. Gary Sue is just the masculine version of it. So a Mary Sue is a female character, a Gary Sue is a male character. And so Will Wheaton on Star Trek The Next Generation is sometimes joked to being a Gary Sue for Gene Roddenberry. It's a self-insert by Gene Roddenberry. Sometimes authors literally self-insert themselves into their work. So in The Dark Tower, at one point, the characters in the novel come to our Earth and meet with Stephen King and talk with him. And so the author himself interacts with the characters and sort of sends them on their way. And so, you maybe don't want to do a ton of that, but that's kind of a possibility that you could literally be yourself in your book. The Game of Thrones technique for character creation was proposed on Reddit, and originally the person created this as an idea for role-playing game characters. So if somebody is trying to create a character for a role-playing game, they had this as an idea for how to create an interesting character. And basically, you just give each character two desires, and that's the entirety of the technique. And so Ned Stark's desires are to live an honorable life and to protect his family, perhaps. And so those are the overriding desires for the character. And every time the character takes an action, if they can be guided by one of those two desires, they should. And then real character growth comes into from how they handle when these two desires conflict with one another. So in Game of Thrones, it turns out that Ned Stark has been lying that Jon Snow is his bastard, and it turns out that Jon Snow was his sister's legitimate child who would have been killed by the king, and Ned Stark claimed him as his bastard so that he wouldn't be in danger of being killed by the king if his true heritage was known, that he was Aegon Targaryen. And so this was Ned Stark's two desires coming into conflict. He wants to live a life of honor. He doesn't want to lie, but he wants to protect his family. So he doesn't want the king to kill his nephew. And so this is, I think, a very interesting way, especially if you're writing something like Game of Thrones, where you had tons of characters and you were trying to keep them all separate and think about how they behave in situations, just giving each of them two desires, and each time there was a decision, trying to connect it to one of those two desires to determine what action they take, I think would be a great, great way to populate a story with a bunch of characters. Um, the narrative itself, what your story should look like, should probably be like a role-playing game campaign. So the way you might structure a role-playing game is a great way to structure a story. And enthusiastic readers have internalized the story structure. So at its most basic, some kind of writers will talk about how a story is made up of a hero who overcomes an obstacle to attain a goal, right? So that's really, really broad. I think you could break almost any story down into a hero overcoming an obstacle to obtain a goal. And most people who've read a lot, even if they don't articulate it that way, if they start putting together a story, it's going to look like that. There's going to be hero and an obstacle and a goal, and they're going to put something together that is an interesting story structure just because they've been so exposed to it. And role-playing game players similarly will have internalized the story of a session in a campaign. And so a lot of role-playing game campaigns will look like maybe the hero's journey, and that's fine. And that's a totally reasonable way to structure a story. If you were writing something that was like the hero's journey, that having it where they're pursuing an objective and they have kind of challenges that they have to overcome, and it lets them progress, and then there's something else they have to do, and thinking about it like a role-playing game could be a great way to write a book. And so just like when you're thinking through what a campaign might look like, if you were thinking about writing a module that people could run, or even just your own notes for a campaign, that's exactly how you'd plan out a story. So the same way you're designing the campaign, that's the outline of your story. And then once you've kind of designed the general story, you can mentally go through the campaign and creating the world and the quest and the characters as you go and what they do at each point. And like the joke was earlier, where you're playing Dungeons and Dragons with yourself as both the player and the DM. And when you're doing this, railroading gets a bad name when you're in a role-playing game where you're kind of trying to move the players along a particular story, but it's absolutely fine when you're writing a story. So you can railroad the characters in a story. That's fine to do. Players don't like it because it removes their agency, but your characters only have as much agency as you give them. So you can railroad all you like when you're writing a book instead of creating a role-playing game campaign.